The wind cut through the narrow streets of the little American town like a blade of ice, rattling loose shutters and bending the weak neon signs that promised hot coffee and cheap meals inside diners. The town was the kind that rarely made it onto maps. It was too small to matter to outsiders, yet to those who lived there, its cracked sidewalks and aging brick buildings held entire worlds of memory, hardship, and resilience. On one particularly bitter evening when the snow fell thick and heavy, a man sat hunched against the wall of a worn-out diner. His figure barely looked human beneath the torn coat he clutched to his chest. His legs, thin and useless, rested awkwardly in a battered wheelchair that squeaked whenever he moved. His hair was unkempt, his beard tangled, and his skin bore the kind of scars that didn't just mark the flesh but told a history of battles most people could not see. People passed him without a glance. Some tightened their coats and walked faster, afraid to catch his eye. Others looked at him with a fleeting mixture of pity and judgment, shaking their heads as if his very presence was the proof of a wasted life. To them, he was just another forgotten soul, someone society had abandoned and written off as hopeless. Inside the diner, however, the story was different. Warm light pooled across the checkered floor tiles. The scent of frying onions and fresh coffee clung to the air, masking the bitterness of the wind outside. And among the clinking dishes and chatter of late-night customers was Emily. Emily was 24 years old but carried the weight of someone twice her age. Her smile was gentle, but her eyes revealed exhaustion. Life had not been kind to her, yet she worked tirelessly, weaving between tables with plates balanced on her arms and a voice soft enough to comfort but strong enough to endure. She was no stranger to hardship. Since her father's death and her mother's absence, Emily had taken responsibility for her younger brother, Daniel. His school fees, his meals, his dreams, they all depended on her. She worked double shifts at the diner, counting tips carefully each night, always praying they would be enough to cover the growing stack of bills at home. Still, for all her worries, she carried something remarkable within her, the ability to see what others ignored. When most people looked at the man in the wheelchair and saw only filth and failure, Emily saw a human being. She saw hunger, loneliness, and the same despair she and Daniel had once felt when they had gone to bed with empty stomachs, hoping their mother might have saved them a piece of bread. Every evening, after serving her last round of customers, Emily slipped out of the back door with a steaming bowl of soup and a slice of bread wrapped in a napkin. She would crouch down by the man, offering the food with no fanfare, no questions, and no judgment. He never told her his name. She never asked. Yet a quiet understanding formed between them. His hollow eyes, usually clouded with sorrow, softened whenever she placed the food in his hands. And though he often said nothing, the faint nod of gratitude was more powerful than any words. As days turned into weeks, the town began to notice. Customers whispered as they watched Emily bring food to the man each night. Some scoffed, muttering that helping beggars only encouraged laziness. Others shook their heads in disbelief, certain she was wasting her kindness on someone who had ruined his own life. Even her manager frowned, worried that generosity might hurt business. But Emily never wavered. She remembered too clearly what hunger felt like, what hopelessness tasted like. To her, offering a bowl of soup was not charity, it was humanity. There were nights when the snow fell so heavily that the streets vanished beneath white blankets. On those nights, Emily wrapped extra bread in napkins and slipped it into his lap, pretending not to notice when her fingers brushed the icy coldness of his trembling hands. When storms rattled the diner's windows, she filled his bowl a little fuller, even though it meant less for herself later. Slowly, what began as a single act of kindness became a ritual neither of them could ignore. The beggar waited quietly, always in the same spot. And Emily, no matter how tired or overwhelmed, always found a way to bring him food. Their bond was wordless but undeniable, a thread woven from compassion that grew stronger with each passing night. Yet beneath the silence, the beggar carried secrets. His scars hinted at struggles untold, and his eyes often drifted far away, as if haunted by memories no one else could imagine. His stillness was not pride but pain, the kind of pain that crushed a person's spirit long before it weakened the body. Emily never asked him about his past. To her, it didn't matter who he had been or what had led him to this state. What mattered was who he was now, a man in need and a man she refused to abandon like the rest of the town had. And so, the weeks rolled into months, and though her life remained hard, double shifts, unpaid bills, late nights spent worrying about Daniel, Emily carried within her a quiet sense of purpose. She might not have had much, but she could give what she did have. What she didn't know, however, was that the story she thought she understood was about to unravel in a way she could never predict. The man she thought was a beggar was far more than he seemed. His silence was not just the silence of pain but the silence of someone carrying a truth so heavy it could no longer remain hidden. The night that truth was revealed would change both of their lives forever. The night that changed everything began with a silence heavier than usual. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the air, catching the orange glow of the street lamps before settling on the cracked pavement outside the diner. Inside, business was slow. Only a handful of weary travelers nursed cups of coffee, their conversations muted against the hum of the heater. Emily noticed him immediately when she stepped outside with his usual bowl of soup. The beggar's posture was different. His body, already frail, seemed to sag further into the wheelchair, as though the weight of the cold was pulling him deeper into himself. His hands trembled as he reached for the bowl, the spoon clattering faintly as he tried to grip it. Emily crouched beside him, steadying his hands with her own. "Careful," she whispered, her breath forming a cloud in the frigid air. "It's hot." For the first time since she had begun feeding him, his eyes didn't just soften with gratitude, they locked onto hers with an intensity that unsettled her. The silence stretched until it became impossible to ignore. His lips parted, and in a low, hoarse voice that sounded as though it hadn't been used in years, he spoke. "I'm not who you think I am." Emily blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "What do you mean?" she asked gently. He swallowed hard, his voice rough and hesitant, yet unwavering in its conviction. "I'm not a beggar. I'm not even poor. I am a billionaire." For a moment, Emily's world tilted. She stared at him, searching his face for signs of delirium. Perhaps the cold had clouded his mind. Perhaps hunger had driven him to imagine a past that never existed. But his eyes, steady, sharp, and filled with pain, told her this was no fevered fantasy. The man leaned back, his breath visible in the air. "Once I owned buildings taller than the clouds. My name was printed on glossy magazines. People lined up to hear me speak. I had glass offices that touched the skyline, cars that cost more than most people's homes, and friends, so many friends that I thought I was invincible." Emily's heart pounded. She clutched the soup bowl tighter, struggling to reconcile the man before her with the image he painted. His coat was threadbare, his shoes nearly falling apart, his beard tangled. He looked like he had nothing. Yet the weight of his voice made her believe he had once possessed everything. "What happened?" she asked softly. His gaze dropped to his trembling hands. "Greed. Betrayal. Ambition." The words dripped like poison. "I spent years chasing more money, more power, more recognition. I thought wealth could buy me happiness, but all it bought me was enemies. The people I trusted most, the ones I called family in boardrooms and in life, stabbed me in the back. Lies, lawsuits, betrayals that tore me apart piece by piece. I fought until I had nothing left inside me. So I walked away. I left it all, my fortune, my empire, my name, because what use was it when I couldn't even trust the people closest to me?" Emily's breath caught. The wind howled, rattling the diner's windows behind them, but she barely noticed. His confession was more chilling than the night air. "My scars," he continued, lifting his sleeve slightly to reveal jagged lines across his arm, "are not just from accidents or illness. They are the remnants of battles, some physical, some invisible. Do you know what it's like to sit in a penthouse surrounded by people and feel completely alone? To have millions in your bank, but no one you can call when your heart is breaking?" Emily shook her head slowly, her chest tight. She couldn't imagine such a life. Poverty she knew. Struggle she understood. But to have everything and still lose it all? That was a pain she had never considered. "I came here," he whispered, his voice breaking, "to disappear. To live among strangers who would not know my name. To feel what it's like to have nothing and still survive. And then you came." Emily blinked back tears. "Me?" He nodded, his eyes glistening. "In all my years of wealth, surrounded by sycophants and opportunists, no one ever gave me something with no expectation attached. Not once. Every smile, every kindness was calculated because they wanted something. Money, power, influence. But you," his voice cracked. "You brought me soup. Bread. You never asked for anything. You didn't even ask who I was. You just saw me as human. Do you know how rare that is?" Emily didn't know what to say. Her throat tightened, her heart thudding against her ribs. She had fed him because she couldn't bear to see anyone starve. It had never occurred to her that those simple acts carried such weight. The man leaned closer, his eyes blazing with sincerity. "You saved me. Not with money. Not with medicine. With kindness. And I will never forget it." They sat in silence for a long moment, the snow falling heavier around them. Emily felt as though the world had paused, holding its breath as a beggar revealed himself to be something far greater and far more broken than anyone had guessed. Finally she found her voice. "Why are you telling me this now?" His lips curled into the faintest smile, though sadness lingered in his gaze. "Because secrets rot the soul. And because you deserve to know that your kindness mattered. More than you could ever imagine." Emily stared at him, stunned. She had thought she was feeding a forgotten man out of pity. Instead, she realized she had been tending to someone who had once held the world in his hands and lost it all. But what struck her most was not his wealth, nor his fall. It was his gratitude. His voice, trembling yet resolute, carried the weight of truth. And in that moment, Emily understood something profound. Wealth and poverty were fragile illusions. What endured, the only thing that mattered, was the kindness people showed each other when the world turned away. That night, Emily walked home in a daze, the words, "I am a billionaire," echoing in her mind. She wanted to believe she had dreamed it, that it was nothing but a strange figment of imagination. But she couldn't. His eyes, his tone, his pain, they were too real. What she didn't know was that this revelation was only the beginning. For the man in the wheelchair had not just confessed his past. In silence, he had already begun shaping her future. The weeks after that revelation felt different. Emily found herself replaying the man's words every time she carried a tray of steaming plates to a customer or counted her tips at the end of the night. "I am a billionaire." The phrase echoed in her mind, colliding with the image of the frail man in the wheelchair, his clothes torn, his hands trembling. To the rest of the town, he was still just the crippled beggar by the diner window. No one suspected the weight of the story he carried. And Emily kept his secret close, unsure what to do with it, unsure if anyone would even believe her. Yet something shifted between them. When she brought him soup now, she didn't just see hunger in his eyes. She saw history. She saw pain. And she saw an ember of determination that hadn't been there before. The man, who still refused to tell her his name, seemed to grow stronger each day. His shoulders straightened, his voice steadied, and though his body remained fragile, his spirit began to flicker back to life. He started asking Emily about her day, about Daniel, about her dreams. She would shrug, embarrassed to admit she had none. "Dreams don't pay the bills," she would say with a tired laugh. But he pressed her gently, encouraging her to think of life beyond debt and double shifts. Unknown to her, every answer she gave became part of a plan he was quietly weaving in the background. He began making calls from a battered old phone Emily had never noticed before. She assumed he was reaching out to shelters or friends, but in truth, his voice was reaching corners of the world far beyond the town's limits. Private bankers, lawyers, trustees, people who had once worked for him were suddenly active again. Though they had not heard from him in years, his voice alone carried authority. His fortune, long hidden behind layers of trusts and quiet withdrawals, was still intact. Yet he moved with caution. He had not come back to reclaim skyscrapers or stock portfolios. His empire could stay in the shadows. What mattered now was Emily, the waitress who had seen him not as a beggar or a billionaire, but as a man. One evening, Emily joined him outside after her shift, carrying her usual soup but lingering longer than usual. The streets were nearly empty, the snow piled high against the curbs. She sat beside him on the cold step, her apron still dusted with flour from the kitchen. "You know," she said softly, "people think I'm foolish for helping you. They say it's pointless. That kindness doesn't change anything." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "And what do you think?" Emily drew in a shaky breath. "I think they're wrong. Maybe I can't change the world. Maybe I can't even change this town. But I can change this moment for you. And sometimes that has to be enough." The man's throat tightened. He wanted to tell her then and there what he was doing, the plans already in motion. But he held back. Some truths were better revealed when the time was right. Instead, he studied her face, illuminated by the flickering diner sign, and said, "Emily, you've already changed more than you realize." She didn't understand, not yet. Days passed and small signs began to appear. A stranger in a sharp suit was spotted at the local bank, inquiring quietly about overdue loans. A lawyer arrived in town, asking questions no one could piece together. Rumors spread, but Emily paid them little mind. She was too busy working, too busy stretching tips into rent, too busy keeping Daniel's school fees paid on time. Then one night, everything began to shift. When Emily returned home after a long shift, she found an envelope slipped under her apartment door. Inside was a letter written in neat, deliberate handwriting. "Emily, what you have given me cannot be repaid with words. But I have tried in my own way to honor it. Please do not be afraid of what comes next. Accept it not as charity but as gratitude. The world measured my wealth in dollars. I measure it now in kindness, and by that measure, you are the richest person I have ever met. A friend. Beneath the letter were papers, legal documents she barely understood at first glance. Her debts gone. Every credit card, every overdue bill wiped clean. Her brother's school fees, covered until graduation. And at the bottom of the stack, the deed to the diner where she had worked endless shifts, now bearing her name. Emily dropped the papers, her knees buckling as she sank to the floor. Tears blurred her vision as she clutched the letter to her chest. This couldn't be real. It was too much, too impossible. Yet every page was stamped, signed, undeniable. She wept not because of the sudden wealth, but because someone had seen her heart and answered it. Her kindness, a bowl of soup offered night after night, had come back to her in a way she could never have imagined. The next morning she rushed to the diner, still in disbelief. The manager handed her the keys with a stunned look, muttering that some mysterious buyer had settled everything overnight. Emily's hands trembled as the cold metal pressed into her palm. The diner, the place where she had poured her youth, her sweat, her exhaustion, was now hers. And yet, the man who had made it possible was gone. His wheelchair sat empty by the window. No note, no trace. Only the faint memory of his steady gaze and the echo of his words, "You saved me." Emily searched for him in the days that followed. She checked shelters, asked strangers, even wandered the outskirts of town. But it was as if he had vanished into the snow. All she had left was the diner, her brother's future secured, and the weight of gratitude she could never return. Still she carried on. And the diner, under her care, changed. She refused to run it like a business alone. She ran it like a sanctuary. No one who entered hungry ever left empty-handed. Those who could not pay were served anyway. The walls that had once echoed with judgment now carried warmth, laughter, and the quiet dignity of shared meals. And every time Emily placed a bowl of soup before a stranger, she felt his invisible presence beside her, the man who had once been broken, who had reminded her that wealth is nothing without compassion. But the story was not finished. His disappearance was not the end. It was only the beginning of a legacy that would ripple far beyond what either of them could see. The days that followed his disappearance were both the hardest and the most profound of Emily's life. She had always defined herself by survival, scraping together tips, stretching meals, and carrying the crushing weight of responsibility. Now, with the diner in her hands and her brother's future secured, she was free in a way she had never dared to imagine. Yet that freedom felt heavy without the man who had given it to her. At first she searched for him everywhere. Each evening she expected to see his wheelchair by the window, his silent figure waiting for soup. Each night she prepared an extra bowl, only to set it aside untouched. She asked customers if they had seen him. She checked the shelters, walked the alleys, and even left notes taped to the lamppost where he had once sat. Nothing. It was as though he had dissolved into the air, carried away by the very snow that had so often covered him. But as weeks turned into months, Emily began to realize that his disappearance was not abandonment. It was a gift. He had not left her with emptiness. He had left her with purpose. The diner, once just a workplace, became her mission. She hired 2 of the local women who had been struggling to find steady work, giving them shifts and dignity. She added a simple policy that startled some but inspired many: if you're hungry, you will be fed. No questions asked. Some called her reckless. Some said she would run the place into the ground. But word spread quickly, and soon the diner was known not only for its warm meals but for its warm heart. Truck drivers stopped by on long routes because they heard it was a place where no one was judged. Single mothers came because they knew their children could eat even if their wallets were empty. Travelers lingered longer, telling stories at the counter, drawn in by the spirit that radiated from the place. Emily worked harder than ever, but her work carried joy instead of despair. She saw in every face a reminder of the man who had sat outside in the cold, invisible to the world but not to her. His presence lingered in every act of kindness, as though his gratitude had woven itself into the very walls of the diner. One evening as she locked up, Daniel tugged at her sleeve. He was taller now, his backpack slung over one shoulder. "Do you ever think about him?" he asked. Emily smiled faintly, gazing at the street where the wheelchair used to rest. "Every day." "Do you think he'll come back?" She shook her head. "I don't know. But I don't need him to. Because he already gave me more than I could ever ask for. He showed me that kindness matters even when the world says it doesn't. That's what I hold on to." Daniel nodded slowly as though he too understood that the man's legacy was not his fortune or even his generosity, It was the proof that compassion, when freely given, can transform everything. Years passed. The diner thrived, not because it made the most money but because it made the most difference. It became a beacon in the small town, a place where strangers left as friends and where hunger was never stronger than kindness. Newspapers wrote small features about it, curious about the young woman who had turned a simple eatery into a sanctuary. Visitors asked about the origin of her mission, and Emily always smiled, keeping the full story close to her heart. Sometimes, late at night, when the lights were dim and the town lay quiet under the stars, she would reread the letter he had left her. The words never faded, though the paper had grown soft with age. "You are the richest person I have ever met." And in those moments, Emily felt him again, not as a beggar, not as a billionaire, but as a soul who had crossed her path to remind her of life's greatest truth, that love and compassion hold more power than money ever will. The world outside the town never knew his name or his story. They did not see his fall from the towers of wealth or his quiet redemption at the hands of a poor waitress. But the people who ate at Emily's diner knew. They felt it in the way she served them with dignity, in the way she refused to let anyone leave hungry. Her story became a quiet legend, told not with headlines, but with steaming bowls of soup placed gently before those who needed them most. And though Emily never saw him again, she carried him with her in every act of kindness, in every debt forgiven, in every stranger welcomed at her table. He had disappeared into the shadows, but the light he had sparked in her burned brighter with each passing year. Life taught Emily one final truth: appearances deceive, wealth fades, and even names can be forgotten. But kindness leaves a mark that time cannot erase. The man who once sat in a wheelchair outside a diner, invisible to the world, had left her not just money or security. He had left her a legacy. A reminder that sometimes the smallest act, offering food without judgment, can ripple into something far greater, something eternal. And so, the waitress who had once struggled to feed herself became the woman who fed an entire town, one bowl of soup at a time. If you had asked Emily what her greatest treasure was, she would not have pointed to the diner deed or her paid bills. She would have smiled and said, "It was the moment I learned that kindness, no matter how small, is never wasted." Because in the end, the richest treasures are not found in banks or businesses. They are found in the human heart, where compassion can rewrite destinies and turn even the most broken lives into stories of hope.